Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. This is really pretty cool to see this great crowd here and to be with one of my friends and heroes, Bill Browder. Welcome to everyone. Bill, I sometimes feel it might be a little bit dangerous being near you because you're kind of a wanted guy. And I even read somewhere that even they kind of, your enemies found you here at Aspen one year. Is that true?
First of all, thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. If there are any Russian agents in the audience, please stand up. I've had a lot of run-ins with Russians in different times. I did actually have a run-in at the Aspen Institute at the Dor Hoosier building. I think it was around 4 years ago. I was accosted by process servers working for the Russian government trying to subpoena me here in Aspen. But I want to tell a quick story about last summer. I was on May 29th last year. I was invited by the chief anti-corruption prosecutor of Spain to come and give evidence about proceeds of the crime that my lawyer Sergei Magnitsky had exposed and was killed over. That money had gone to Spain. So he invites me to Spain. I arrive on the 29th of May, and my meeting with the prosecutor is at 11 a.m. the next morning. I check into my hotel that night. They ask me for my passport. I give them my passport. They were very nice to me. I booked it on my Platinum American Express card, and they gave me a big upgrade. The hotel manager showed me to the room. He was very proud of the room. And the next morning, I'm going to breakfast at 9:45, and I open up the door, and the hotel manager, the guy who had been so proudly showing me into the room, was standing there with two very large uniformed Spanish police officers. And he said, "Mr. Browder," very sheepishly, he said, can you show these gentlemen your identification?" So I give them my passport. One of the cops then compares it with a piece of paper he has in his hand, and he says, "You're under arrest." And I said, "What for?" And he said, "Interpol, Russia." And my heart sank when I heard this. And the hotel manager was really worried because this fancy room that he had upgraded me to, he thought it was going to continue to be occupied with my belongings while I was arrested. And so he sort of quickly, in Spanish, which I didn't understand, started negotiating with the police officers to allow me to pack my bags so that I could clear out of the room. And it was actually a series of rooms because it was such a nice setup he had given me with the upgrade. And so I went into the and the police officers allowed me to go and do this. And so I went into the room where they couldn't see me, and I quickly tweeted out, "Urgent, being arrested in Madrid, Spain on a Russian Interpol arrest warrant right now." And then I came out of the room with my bags. We went down. I paid my bill. They then pushed me into the back of the police car. And it was a real police car with, the windows don't go down. You can't open the doors. There's big, thick plexiglass between you and the police officers. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder if people believed my tweet because, maybe my account had been hacked or something like that. And so and the police officers didn't take away my phone or pat me down. And so I took out my phone and I snapped a picture from the back of their heads, and then you could see all the radios and stuff on the dashboard, and I tweeted that one out, and I said, "In the back of the police car going to the police station." And at this point, it was clear that I was being arrested, and I could see all the news alerts on my phone and all this kind of stuff, and the fact that I had tweeted it out had set off this sort of viral interchange of messages going all around the world, and I finally got to the police station, and everybody, they were all very excited in the police station. They how often do they get an international fugitive? and people were sort of popping their head in to get a good look at me, and you could really feel like that this was like a pretty great day for this police station in central Madrid. And I was sitting there for about an hour, and all of a sudden you could just feel the mood of the police station deflate, and then the lady who was the official translator comes in and says, "I'm sorry, sir, we we've just been informed that the arrest warrant has been invalidated by Interpol. You're free to go. So when I say that I'm delighted to be here today, I really am delighted to be here.
So, Bill, this is, I mean, we're laughing a little bit, but it's pretty serious because we know that Vladimir Putin murders his enemies, not just people inside Russia, but he's gone after people who have opposed them beyond their borders. So this is serious business. And I'd like you to tell your basic story about Magnitsky, but maybe from the angle of why have you gotten under the skin of Vladimir Putin? Why have you become like one of the people in the world that he is most angry and frustrated with?
Well, let me start out. Why did I go to Russia in the first place? You hear my accent. I was born in Princeton, New Jersey. I was brought up in Chicago, but I come from a very unusual American family. My grandfather was a labor union organizer from Wichita, Kansas. And he was so good at organizing the union in the 1920s that the communists spotted him and said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Moscow to check it out? So he goes to Moscow. He does what most single red-blooded American men do when they get to Moscow. He found a Russian girl who became my grandmother. My father was born there. And then 5 years later, he was tapped to go back to America to lead the Communist Party of the United States. And he was the head of the American Communist Party. He ran for president in 1936 and 1940 against Roosevelt on the communist ticket. He was imprisoned by Roosevelt in 41, pardoned in 42, kicked out of the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist, and then viciously persecuted during the McCarthy era for being a communist. And I was born in 1964. I'm 55 years old. And in the 1970s, when I was going through my teenage rebellion, I was trying to figure out a great way to rebel from this family of communists. And you can't tell now, but I grew my hair long, and it grew into an afro, and that didn't upset my family. I followed the Grateful Dead around for 3 months. That didn't upset my family. But then I came up with the perfect way to upset my family, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And that really upset my family. I became a capitalist. I went to Stanford Business School. I graduated business school in 1989, the year the Berlin Wall came down. I thought if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. I moved to London, and then I eventually moved to Russia, and I set up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund. And I succeeded in my goal. It went from nothing to becoming the largest foreign investment fund in the country. The problem was that all the companies that I was investing in were run by these people called the Russian oligarchs. And the Russian oligarchs are not nice people. And the Russian oligarchs were stealing money hand over fist out the back door of these companies that I was a shareholder in. And so I decided that I was going to try to stop the stealing. And the way that I tried to stop the stealing was to research how they did the stealing and then share that research with the international media. And so we would start running these naming and shaming campaigns of the biggest companies in Russia. Gazprom, the National Electricity Company, the National Savings Bank, various other companies. And as you can imagine, the people who were doing the stealing weren't so happy to have their stealing exposed. And in November of 2005, I was stopped at the border. I'd been there for 10 years. I was the largest investor in Russia, $4.5 billion under management. I was stopped at Sheremetyevo Airport. I was arrested. I was put in the detention center of the airport. I was kept there for 15 hours. And then the next day I was deported and declared a threat to national security of Russia. And at this point, I pulled all of my people out. I liquidated all of my holdings. And I thought that that was the end of the story. But it turns out it was the beginning of the worst nightmare you could ever imagine. About 18 months later, and the one thing I did do was I kept an office in Moscow. And 18 months later, I got a frantic call from the one person in the office, the secretary, who said, there are 25 police officers raiding the office. What should I do? And I said, I'm not sure. Let me call my lawyer in Moscow. And I called an American lawyer I worked with there. And I said, there's 25 police officers raiding my office. What should I do? And he said, I'm not sure. There's 25 police officers raiding my office looking for your documents. Let me call you back. And the police were looking for the stamps, seals, and certificates for our investment holding companies. They found them at the law firm's office. And then they used these stamps, seals, and certificates to steal $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government in the previous year. It was a complex fraud that I don't have time to go into this evening, but it's all described in my book if you want to read it, called Red Notice. But in the process of this fraud going on, I hired a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei was a 35-year-old lawyer who worked for an American law firm, and I had him investigate and try to figure out how to stop this whole thing. He figured out the whole scam. He figured out who was involved. He testified against the police officers who were involved. And about 5 weeks after his testimony, the same police officers came to his home at 8 in the morning on the 24th of November, 2008. They arrested him. They put him in pretrial detention, where they then started to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. He was put in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds, and they left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor, and the sewage would bubble up. They moved him around from cell to cell to cell. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against these corrupt police officers. And they wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million of taxes, and he did so on my instruction. And they figured, here's a lawyer who's wearing a blue suit and a red tie and buys his Starbucks in the morning before he works at a fancy law firm. He'll buckle within a week. And they completely misjudged Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei was a man of incredible principle and integrity. And for him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing a false witness was more awful than the physical torture they were inflicting on him, and he refused. And with his refusal, things got worse and worse and worse. After 6 months of this, his health broke down. He ended up getting terrible pains in his stomach. He ended up losing 40 pounds. And he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. A week before the operation, his persecutors came to him, again asked him to sign a false confession. Again, he refused. In retaliation, they abruptly moved him from a prison that had a medical wing where he was supposed to have his operation to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, considered to be one of the worst prisons in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, they had no medical wing there that could treat his ailment. And at Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into a terrible downward spiral, ear-piercing pain, untreated pain. He and his lawyers wrote 20 different desperate requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system of Russia. Every different branch of the criminal justice system of Russia either ignored or denied in writing his desperate requests for medical attention. And on the night of November 16, 2009, he went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore. They put him in an ambulance and sent him to a different prison that had a medical wing. But when he arrived at this different prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat Sergei Magnitsky to death. That was November 16, 2009.
Bill, I want you to keep the story going, but can you just talk a little bit more, about Sergei himself, about what kind of person he was? How well did you know him? Can you bring him a little bit more to life for us? Obviously, his incredible courage and not buckling under this torture, but tell us a little more about Sergei the person.
Well, so Sergei was probably what I would describe as a stubborn idealist. He was sort of he was the face of what the good face of Russia. He was the type of person that Russia should have been sort of the future of Russia, and what was really heartbreaking about his story, I mean, everything is heartbreaking about his story, but what was particularly heartbreaking about his story was that he, up until the last moments of his life, he always thought the rule of law would eventually prevail. And one of the things he did during his time in prison was every time they would do something terrible to him, he would write a criminal complaint. And over the course of 358 days, he wrote 450 criminal complaints. And he believed that somehow, if he just kept on, using the law would prevail, and that this horribleness would stop. The fact that the country and the law and everything about failed him is really such a terrible indictment of what Russia is. That he was this face of the good, honest, optimistic Russia, and they snubbed him out.
And so, how did you feel when you heard about his death? And obviously, it was a life-changing experience for you as well.
So I got the news of Sergei Magnitsky's murder the next morning at 7:25 a.m., and it was the most heartbreaking, life-changing, traumatic, horrible news I could have ever gotten. It was just like a knife going right into my heart. Sergei Magnitsky was killed effectively as my proxy. If Sergei Magnitsky hadn't been working for me, he'd still be alive today. And the burden of responsibility, the burden of guilt that he was killed effectively in my place was overwhelming. At first there was just terrible sort of chaos in my mind, and then eventually, once I was able to think clearly, it became obvious to me that I really had only one choice, which was to put aside everything else I was doing and devote all of my time, all of my resources, and all of my energies to going after the people who killed him and make sure they face justice. And coming to your original question, why does Putin hate me so much, is because I was able, over some period of time, to be able to get some measure of justice for Sergei Magnitsky.
All right, so explain in a simple way, if you can, what the Magnitsky Act is and why it's such a powerful tool on behalf of human rights, and the story of how you got it passed in 5 minutes.
Well,
by the way, Red Notice, if any of you, is a fantastic book that summarizes this whole thing, but we're going to get the précis.
So after Sergei was killed, I said we need to get justice. And then we tried to get justice first in Russia. And because he had written all these complaints that were all, we had copies of, we had the most well-documented human rights abuse cases come out of Russia in the last 35 years. And I thought, maybe we weren't going to be able to prosecute everybody, but we surely should be able to prosecute a lot of the people.
Did he send you the complaints?
Well, so what happened was that once a month or so, they were handwritten complaints. He knew the law perfectly. He would write the complaints, hand them to his lawyer. His lawyer would file them. The government would reject them, but we got copies. And so we have copies of all these complaints, and they were very granular, very detailed, and very damning. And we figured maybe that we'd probably get justice inside of Russia. But there was no chance of that. The government, the Putin regime, circled the wagons. They exonerated every single person who was involved. Vladimir Putin personally got involved in the exoneration process. They gave promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. And in the most horrifying miscarriage of justice, they put Sergei Magnitsky on trial 3 years after they killed him. It was the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. They found him guilty. They put me on trial as his co-defendant. I was also found guilty, sentenced to 9 years in absentia. So it was clear there was no chance of justice inside of Russia. So then I said, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And the answer was that the people who killed him did it for $230 million. And they don't keep that money in Russia because as easy as they stole it, it could be stolen from them. They keep that money in the West. They keep that money in real estate in New York and the south of France, and then bank accounts in Switzerland and London, and ski chalets in Aspen, and all sorts of other stuff. And so I came up with this idea, which is that we might not be able to prosecute them for murder and torture in Russia, but there's no reason why they should be able to travel to the United States and other countries and spend their money. And so I took this idea to Washington. And it's actually not a coincidence that I'm sitting here with Mike, who's head of Freedom House, because in Washington I needed to find an organization that cared about human rights to be my partner. I didn't know anything about navigating the corridors of power in Washington. And Freedom House became my partner. And Freedom House came to every meeting with me. And I first went to meet with Senator Benjamin Cardin, Democrat from Maryland, along with Freedom House. And then I went to Senator John McCain, Republican from Arizona, and I told them the story of what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. And I said, can we ban their visas and freeze their assets? And the two senators said yes. And that became the Magnitsky Act. And the Magnitsky Act started with just the Magnitsky case, and then all sorts of other victims of human rights abuse from Russia started showing up and saying, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you sanction the people who killed my father, my brother, my sister, my aunt? And after about a dozen of these calls, I got a call from Senator Cardin, and he said, how would you feel about broadening this to apply to all Russian human rights violators? And I said, I can't think of a more beautiful way to honor Sergei's memory than that. And the Magnitsky Act grew and grew and grew. And in Washington, where people can't agree on almost anything, this was something that everybody could agree on. And when it went for a vote in the Senate, it passed 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And on December 14th, 2012, President Obama signed the Magnitsky Act into law. And Vladimir Putin went crazy.
Well, this is a sort of a serious question. How do we know that the Magnitsky Act is working?
Well, a lot of people ask me that question, and the answer is we know by how crazy Vladimir Putin got. So the most horrible part of his reaction, and many of you will remember this, but you might not have made the connection, is that in retaliation for the Magnitsky Act passing, Vladimir Putin banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. And that sounds pretty bad on the surface, but let me explain to you how bad it is. That the Russians had been allowing Americans and other Westerners to come to Russia to adopt for many years, but they started to basically only allow the sick orphans to be adopted by American families. The healthy ones, they wouldn't put up for adoption. And when I say sick, I mean children who were born with HIV from their mothers, with fetal alcohol syndrome, with Down syndrome, etc. And Americans came year after year in the thousands with open arms and open hearts and brought these sick children back from Russia to America and nursed them to health. The children who stayed in Russia, they just don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources in the orphanages to treat these children, and many of them die before the age of 18. So by banning the adoption of Russian orphans, Vladimir Putin was sentencing his own orphans to death as a retaliation to the Magnitsky Act. And that gives you some idea of how crazy Putin was about this. It was such a crazy and emotional and self-destructive thing.
Well, was he worried that he himself would be sanctioned?
Well, so that's the key. And so one of the things which we learned when the Panama Papers came out, we've been also tracking the money of where the $230 million went. And many of you will remember Panama Papers was this big leak that came out of this Panamanian law firm, Mossack Fonseca. And in every country there was a star of the Panama Papers, and the star of Russia was a man named Sergei Roldugin. Most of you won't know his name, but you'll know his profession. He was a cellist. And Sergei Roldugin was a cellist who was worth $2 billion. I think he was the wealthiest musician in the world and certainly the wealthiest cellist by far. But there's no reason why a cellist would be worth $2 billion. And so everybody said, why is he worth so much money? And the answer is he's Putin's best friend from childhood. He's the godfather of Putin's daughter, and he's a nominee for holding Putin's assets. And we discovered that Sergei Roldugin got some of the money from the $230 million. So why is Putin so upset about the Magnitsky Act? Is the Magnitsky Act says that anyone who was involved in the Magnitsky case anyone who profited from the Magnitsky case and anyone who commits other gross human rights abuses in Russia will be sanctioned. Well, Putin figures into all three of those categories. And most importantly, Vladimir Putin is a very rich man. Vladimir Putin, in my estimation, is worth $200 billion. And he doesn't keep that money in his own name. He keeps it in the name of oligarchs, and that money is held offshore. And Putin very realistically understands that at some point in time, all that money that he imprisoned people over, killed people over, stole, extorted, extracted, all that hard work that he put into accumulating that fortune could be confiscated at any moment with a swipe of a pen because of what Bill Browder did. And that's why he hates it so much, and that's why he has made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act, and that's why he sent in a Russian lawyer to Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016, with one specific ask of Donald Trump Jr., which is if his father gets elected, will he repeal the Magnitsky Act?
I want to talk a little bit about Putin, if I could. And by the way, in about 10 minutes, we're going to open this up for some questions. But I want a few more questions for Bill from me. When Putin took power in 2000, you were quoted in the papers as being somewhat complimentary of him. And you flipped, obviously, on him for obvious reasons. But tell me what you think you might have gotten wrong about Putin, or what was your misread about Putin?
So the history. So pre-Putin, there was Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia. Boris Yeltsin Boris Yeltsin did a deal with the devil, which was, in order to become president, he allowed 22 oligarchs to steal 40% of the country from the government. And in that time, it was this terrible period of what we called oligarch capitalism, where these 22 oligarchs had the yachts and planes and villas, and the average male died at the age of 58 because there wasn't enough medicine in the hospital. Nurses had to prostitute themselves to support their families. Professors became taxi drivers. Art museums sold the paintings off the walls, and so everybody was longing for the end of oligarch capitalism. And so Putin shows up, and he says, he shows up as the successor to Yeltsin, and he says, we're going to end this oligarch stuff. And I cheered, and everybody else cheered. But it turned out that for a period of time, Putin behaved, I would argue, he acted in the national interest before he was able to assemble enough power to be a dictator. And I praised him, and other people praised him, and as it turned out, I was pretty damn wrong. But what happened was he didn't want to get rid of the oligarchs. He just wanted to become the biggest oligarch himself. And when he became the biggest oligarch, there's an expression: absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's what happened.
So, in your experience in being Putin's principal foe, in some ways, what lessons do you draw from that experience that should inform how the West should deal with him? So we had a situation today, where the President of the United States met with him, kind of actually joked a little bit about the interference with the election, which doesn't seem like that much of a joke to many people. I think he also, I believe, either was going to meet or had met with Theresa May. Is this the right way for the West to deal with someone like Putin?
So just so you understand why Putin is doing what he's doing, is that Putin has stolen, between Putin's money and the money of the top 1,000 people, they've stolen $1 trillion over the last 20 years. And that money should have been spent on hospitals, on roads, on schools, and on everything else. And so the average Russian is living a very bad life, just like it was in the pre-Putin days, but in fact worse. And he's living in a situation which should be a democracy, where people can actually, in theory, could vote to get rid of him. And so people, in theory, should be angry with him. And so what he's had to do is he's had to deflect their anger in outside. So if you're somebody who doesn't want people to be angry at you, you've got to create somebody else to be angry at. And so what Putin has done is he's started foreign wars. They started a war with Ukraine. Russia has no beef with Ukraine. It's a totally fake war created to create a war in order to have an enemy so that everyone could rally around Putin. It's the reason for all this action in Syria. And it's kind of the reason for all this action everywhere else. Putin can't raise Russia up to the rest of the world, so he wants to bring the rest of the world down to him. And he's exporting it in the form of election meddling, in the form of money laundering, in the form of bots, in the form of hacking. And so I would say that the way that the United States and the Western world dealt with the Soviet Union during the communist time was a strategy of containment. And everyone understood that the communists were dangerous. They're trying to spread communism. We need to stop them. We need to contain them. We now have a criminal regime. The Putin regime is a criminal regime. And we also need a policy of containment. But it doesn't really help when Donald Trump is busy joking with him about election hacking. It doesn't help when Theresa May, whose country, I live in Britain, I'm a British citizen, I've been living there for 30 years. Last year, the Russians committed an act of chemical weapons terror in Salisbury. And Theresa May is having a bilateral with the president of Russia at the G20 today. That just makes no sense to me. And that's not the proper strategy for dealing with a malign figure like Vladimir Putin.
So, Bill, what is your recommendation for countries like the United States and other countries of how to deal with them? Are there other laws that need to be passed? Obviously, one thing would be to enforce and implement the Magnitsky Act. What other steps do you recommend for dealing with Putin?
Well, so Vladimir Putin, as I mentioned, is I believe the richest man in the world. And he doesn't hold that money in his own name. He holds that money in the name of oligarch trustees. Some of the big famous oligarchs you read about in the financial press, that when you hear about their wealth, that's not all their money. Some of that money is Putin's. And so it's really easy. During the Brezhnev era, these guys didn't have all their money offshore. They have a huge Achilles heel. The leverage we have is all their money offshore. And the way you deal with it, and we started to do this in April of last year, the United States, in response to the election hacking, sanctioned 7 of the richest Russian oligarchs. And that was devastating. That was probably the single most powerful foreign policy move ever. And Vladimir Putin was absolutely shocked. And the way we deal with these people is to go after the oligarchs, go after their money, because a lot of that money is Vladimir Putin's. And he values money more than human life. And so if you go after his money, that's where we have the leverage.
I'm going to throw it up into questions in 1 second. Let me just ask you one final question, just on well, I guess you've answered the question partially, but I just wonder if you can just elaborate on it. Why was Putin so interested in interfering with the U.S. election, with stealing having his people steal the emails and running the ads on Facebook and all the other things he did to try to sow division in our country? Why was it so important with him to do that?
Well, so as I've said, his single largest foreign policy priority in writing was to repeal the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act also metastasized into all these other sanctions programs. And he knew that if Hillary Clinton was elected, there was no chance of getting rid of any of this stuff. And he saw an opening with Donald Trump. And let me just ask a question. This is a really important question. And don't be embarrassed if you don't raise your hand. How many people have actually read the Mueller report in this room? So let's say 3%. You don't have to read the whole thing. Each section has an executive summary. I encourage every one of you to spend 2 hours of your life and read the Mueller report. It goes into such incredible, damning detail about what the absolutely 100% for sure, whether you're a Trump supporter or not, the Russians illegally hacked the U.S. election, and that there's no controversy about that. And they did it because they thought that Donald Trump would be a better president for them.
Okay, I'm going to throw it open for questions, and we have 2 Aspen staffers with mics, so if you want to be recognized, just raise your hand and I'll try to do it. sir, right here. And just if you could just please wait for the microphone to come to you.
Putin stole an oil company. I believe he jailed and later released a man whose name I think was Khodorkovsky. Whatever happened to him and the oil company, I imagine, is now Lukoil.
So you got the name right of the oligarch, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. The oil company that they seized was called Yukos. He was the richest man in Russia. And in fact, the reason that Putin arrested him was Putin likes to rule by symbolism and by example. And when Putin made his play to become the biggest oligarch, he took the previously biggest oligarch, stuck him in jail, put him on trial, allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia on trial, sitting in a cage. And so imagine you're the 17th richest oligarch in Russia. You're on your yacht. It's parked off the hotel du Cap in Antibes. You've just finished up with your mistress in the bedroom. You pad out to the living room. You flick on CNN, and there you see a guy far richer, far better, far more powerful than you sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction going to be? You don't want to sit in that cage. And so one by one, they went to Putin and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do to make sure we don't sit in the cage? And he said 50%. And that was the moment that he became the richest man in the world. Whatever became of Michael Khodorkovsky, he was put in jail for 9 years and 4 months. He was released right before the Sochi Olympics when Putin was trying to make a play to show how wonderful he was and how lenient he was. Instead of having this man in jail for 10 years, 9 years and 4 months, it's just such an act of generosity. He now lives in London, and we work together on trying to hold Putin to account.
That lady back there, you could stand and just wait for a microphone. Oh, sorry.
Do you have information that was interesting to Mueller, and were you interviewed by Mueller?
Great question.
I have all sorts of interesting information. I was actually in the Mueller report. If you search my name, you'll find, I think there was 14 mentions of my name in the Mueller report, which all dates back. So in the Trump Tower meeting on June 9th, 2016, the female Russian lawyer who was an agent of Vladimir Putin, Natalia Veselnitskaya, went into that meeting to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner. Donald Trump had just been nominated the Republican nominee. And she went in there and she said, I'd like the Magnitsky Act repealed. But she also said, if Donald Trump becomes president, could you have Bill Browder arrested? And there's some very famous notes which show up in the Mueller report of Paul Manafort from his iPhone, where it has Bill Browder and a bunch of other stuff under it. And so I was a central part of this whole thing. And interestingly, that was the one part of the, other than the obstruction of justice part of the Mueller report, where they said that Donald Trump Jr. Had effectively broken the law by looking for foreign value of foreign information that had value in order to help their campaign.
Bill, before I go to another question, there's one thing I forgot that I wanted to ask you about. And one thing just for this group to know about Bill is he's kind of a small NGO into himself. It's like you and your Twitter account and a couple of financial advisors that are making a huge ruckus and stink that really equals a lot of the impact of a lot of more sizable human rights organizations. And so people come to you with requests for help. And we were talking at dinner a little bit about this case of this Russian family that had their business essentially stolen by the Russians and had fled to where they thought they might be safe, Guatemala, and it didn't turn out so well for them. And to tell us that story, 'cause I think it's kind of indicative of kind of the way Putin operates.
It's actually really, so I wrote my book in 2015, in early 2015, and I set up a special email account that you could email me if you have something to say about my book. and I got some nice letters. People loving my book. A few hate letters as well. And then one day I got this letter from a woman, a Russian woman, who had the most horrible story to tell. And her story was the following: that she and her husband and their daughter, she and her husband owned a pulp paper mill in St. Petersburg, Russia. And the FSB, the Russian secret police, came to them and said, "We want to have your pulp and paper mill, please." And they said no. And after that, the 16-year-old daughter was kidnapped and then raped repeatedly, and then they paid a ransom and finally got her back. And then the Russian government then swooped in and used some state banks to call in loans that weren't due for 10 years, called them in overnight, bankrupted the company, seized all the assets, auctioned them off. They were worth $500 million, auctioned them off for $100,000, and then went after the family. And the family first went to Latvia. They thought that was too close to Russia. Then they went to Turkey and realized Turkey had an extradition treaty with Russia. And then they found on the internet that Guatemala didn't have an extradition treaty with Russia. So they found a law firm in Guatemala that offered to get them proper documents so they could emigrate. They changed their names. They emigrated to Guatemala. They went into hiding. They didn't have much money left. The father became a science teacher at a local high school. The mother became a drawing teacher. The daughter, who was hugely traumatized, started to slowly recover from this terrible kidnapping and rape situation. They had another child in Guatemala. And then 5 years after they arrived in Guatemala, the Russians found out about them and tracked them down. And then the most unbelievable thing, there was an organization that was set up by the United Nations to fight lawlessness, impunity, and corruption in Guatemala called CISEG. It was a UN organization. The US government paid about 45% of their budget. And the Russians found a way to get CISEG to prosecute the family for passport violations. They prosecuted the family, and they sentenced the father to 19 years in jail for passport violations, the mother and daughter to 14 years, and then they put the 3-year-old son in a Guatemalan orphanage. And the mother wrote to me from jail about this whole thing, and this was such a heartbreaking story, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do something about it. And the fact of the matter was that I knew how to do something about it because I'd spent some time in Washington lobbying for the Magnitsky Act. And so I put together a PowerPoint presentation, and I went to Washington, and I went to the same people that supported the Magnitsky Act, and I told them the story. And I said, we can't allow this, and specifically, we can't allow the United States government to pay the budget to this organization that clearly did this incredible act of aggression against this family. And I was very pleased that Senator Roger Wicker and Congressman Chris Smith held hearings at the U.S. Helsinki Commission on the Bitkoff family last year. And as part of the hearings, I went and testified. The family lawyers went and testified. And my recommendation was that the United States government withhold funding to this organization for what they did. And they withheld the funding, and the family has since been released from prison.
I had a question about, could you compare Stalin's hold on dictatorial power with Putin's? How do they compare?
Well, in a certain way, so Stalin killed tens of millions of people. Putin has not killed tens of millions of people. Putin is a much more efficient dictator. And the way that Putin operates is he creates a climate of terror. But he doesn't have to. He kills people, and he kills a lot of people. But he doesn't have to kill that many people. What Putin does is he picks out the most emblematic person in any given class of people he wants to terrorize. Like in the case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the oligarch, he picks the biggest oligarch. He really does terrible stuff to him and everybody around him. It wasn't just Khodorkovsky went to jail. Everybody who worked for him, anyone who had anything to do with him, went to jail or fled the country. And then no other oligarch peeped up. I was the largest foreign investor in the country complaining about corruption. Look what they did to me. Guess what? There's no other foreign investors complaining about corruption. And Boris Nemtsov was the most outspoken opposition politician. They murder him in front of the Kremlin. Guess what? There are no more opposition politicians. And so Putin has been he's very efficient about his dictatorship. He's a completely different type of dictator. He's also not an idealistic or ideological dictator. Putin is not. He has no ideology. He's just a criminal. I wouldn't compare him to Joseph Stalin. I'd compare him with Pablo Escobar. That's probably, except that with Pablo Escobar, he didn't have access to a nuclear arsenal.
If I could actually add one thing to that, I think Putin, it is not to toot the horn of my organization, we have a great report on our website about the tactics of modern authoritarianism, and Putin is example A, and other dictators have kind of copied it. He's also, in addition to all the stuff that Bill has said, he's also gone after the press, he's gone after the court system, he's gone after civil society. Basically, he's neutered all the potential opposition to him, and other people are watching those tactics. Other questions? Maybe there, sir.
What would you say is the best case scenario at this point? I mean, if Putin leaves, is it a cultural thing within the oligarchy where it's going to stay like this? Is there some scenario that we could all hope for? What should we be wishing for?
Well, so Putin, there is no exit strategy for Vladimir Putin. He's stolen all this money. He's killed and falsely imprisoned all these people. None of the money is in his own name. If he's ever to lose power, and he calls up somebody and says, could you wire over $1 billion? He'll say, I'm sorry, Vladimir who? And worse than that, so he wouldn't get access to his money because the money's not in his own name. He'd be arrested. Terrible things would happen to him in jail. And so there's not going to ever be a Putin presidential library that he can gracefully retire to. And the problem with this is that the longer it goes on for, it doesn't matter whether he's the greatest leader in the world, no one's going to like you after 20 years. People just get tired of anybody. And they particularly get tired when the economics are not good, and the economics are not good in Russia. And so the worse the economics get, the more foreign enemies and adventures they have to go on, and the more domestic repression they have to engage in. And so there is no optimistic scenario that I could predict about how Russia is going to evolve. I think it's going to get worse. I think that people are going to get angrier. Putin is going to get more aggressive and adventurous in the world, and we have to prepare ourselves for that.
Back there, sir.
It's been reported that Russian oligarchs launder their money to the State of Israel. Is that true? And if that's true, why is that?
Well, so I'm actually a great expert on where they've laundered the money, because one of the other tasks, in addition to the Magnitsky Act, that I've been involved in is tracing who got the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over. And for the last 10 years, I've had a team of investigators, forensic investigators, looking for that money. And we found that money. And that money has gone to a lot of places, and a lot of places you wouldn't expect. And I can say that in this particular investigation, Israel hasn't showed up, but weirdly, Denmark has. Denmark has a bank. The largest bank in Denmark is called Danske Bank. And we discovered that of the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky exposed and was killed over, 200 million of that went through Danske Bank. And when we started pulling on the thread, we started working with the largest Danish newspaper called Berlingske, and they started looking at the data we had and some other data they had, and they discovered it wasn't 200 million, it was about 8.5 billion. And then Danske Bank had to do their own external investigation, and they discovered it wasn't 8.5 billion. It was $234 billion of illicit funds from the former Soviet Union and Russia was laundered through Danske Bank. Denmark, which is considered to be on another one of these indices, the second most honest country in the world based on Transparency International's index, was involved in the largest money laundering scandal in the history of Europe. And it wasn't just Danske Bank, because the money, in order to launder money, it's got to go through a lot of banks, so that the 200 million that we found through Danske Bank then went to Swedbank, which is Sweden's largest bank, and Nordea Bank, which is Finland's largest bank, and there's all sorts of people and banks and situations you just wouldn't expect. And I'll tell you, the biggest money laundering hub in the entire world is London. In London, they all, this is my hometown. They all speak with nice accents and they all wear nice suits. And there's a lot of really crooked bankers in London. And what makes it really hard is that the British police do not prosecute money launderers. And so if anyone here is a money launderer and you want to be okay, do it in London.
Okay, we had a lady right there. Wait, what?
Does Putin have anything over Trump? It just appears that it's completely illogical for Trump to continue being so buddy-buddy. I mean, it can't just be because he doesn't want to appear that he won partly the election because of his help. There has to be something more than this. Is there?
Well, so coming back to the Mueller report, the Mueller report has a whole section on collusion, and Mueller had a great access to information. They had wiretaps, they had subpoena powers, they had all sorts of great stuff. And in the Mueller report, and I encourage everybody, please read it. It's interesting, and it's even sort of fun reading because in the Mueller report, there on the section of collusion, what you have is a whole bunch of people in the Trump organization all desperately trying to collude with Russia. You have George Papadopoulos, Carter Page, and Paul Manafort, and all sorts of people. And they're all lying to each other in the Trump campaign about all the prospects of collusion and how great it's going to be when they do collude and how the great contacts they have to collude with. And they kind of couldn't find anyone to collude with, according to the Mueller report. And then you've got a whole bunch of people from Russia. You have the head of the Russian Foreign Direct Investment Fund and the head of one of Russia's most important banks, all desperately looking for people in the Trump campaign to collude with, and apparently not being able to find anyone to collude with. And so they're all kind of missing each other in the middle of the night. And then you have everybody in the Trump organization going right up to Donald Trump, lying to everybody about everything to do with this, with their involvement in Russia. And so all I can say is what's written in that report. The report doesn't find any, it doesn't find evidence of collusion that's prosecutable. Doesn't mean the intelligence community hasn't found at a lower standard what they believe to be collusion, but I think we have to rely on Mueller's report, which is that there was no collusion.
Bill, we're sort of running out of time, and I'm not possibly going to be able to get to all the questions. I will say to everyone that Bill will be signing copies of Red Notice somewhere in the hotel outside. But there are two questions that I just going to take the moderator's chair to ask. One is, can you tell us what's happened to Sergei Magnitsky's family? How have they done personally, 10 years later? That's number one. And number two, can you just give us a little bit of a look ahead to your next book and what's that about?
So on the Magnitsky family, after Sergei was killed, it was the most, for them more than anybody, the most traumatic thing that could ever happen. And he wasn't just killed, but they then tried to prosecute him afterwards, and they made the family sort of sit as his representative, as the accused, and they really were harassing the family in all sorts of ways. And so I evacuated them from Russia. They live in London now. They're under my support and protection, and they're as good as anyone could be, having gone through this type of trauma. His youngest son is off to university next year in America, and they're trying to live a normal. He had two children. And what was your second question?
Your next project,
next
book's project, which I hear you're writing a little bit here in Aspen.
I'm writing my next book, and my next book is going to be all about this crazy stuff that's happened, how the Magnitsky Act has led to this huge geopolitical crisis and all the further murders, poisonings, dead bodies, arrests, et cetera, that have happened. And I think it'll be just as exciting, perhaps more exciting than the first book. So, but I've got a high bar. People have complimented me on the first book. Every time they do now, I think, oh God, I got a really better book the next time.
All right, I'm going to take three final questions. Let's have real quick rapid fire questions, and Bill, you can answer them all. and then we'll go to book signing. Mark, I'm calling on you.
Has there been any expansion or development of the Magnitsky Act around the world to other countries? If so, to what degree? And if not, why not?
Okay. And anyone else have a question back there? The gentleman back there in the back.
China, Russia, Xi Jinping, and Putin, the BRI, and them China building a transport hub outside Moscow.
Okay. Is there a question in there? You want to know Bill's reaction?
It's okay, I'll react.
Okay.
Yeah, I apologize.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah, just what do you think of the relationship then because of that between Xi Jinping and Putin?
Okay. And all right, you gentlemen in the front row.
Yes, the three of us have read your book, and you finished it, I think, in 2015. One of the things you talked about was the rule of law, and without it, what would happen. So is there been a drop in investment, outside investment in Russia during this period since you finished the book?
Okay, so all good questions, thank you. On the Magnitsky Act, we now have a Magnitsky Act in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Estonia, in Latvia, in Lithuania. We have one on deck in Australia. The European Union has it on deck. And then a number of individual European Union countries, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Romania, Czech Republic, all have, and Italy, all have Magnitsky legislation working its way through. It is the new technology for dealing with bad guys. It used to be that we would sanction countries, and then the people who would, in the countries, these poor people would suffer, and the oligarchs and the dictators would fly in plane loads of champagne and caviar and be fine. This is much more specific. It's like it goes right after the bad guys. It leaves everybody else out of the picture. And there is nothing worse than being added to the Magnitsky list. When you get put on the Magnitsky list, every bank in the world shuts your account that minute. Nobody will do any business with you at that point forward. You become a non-entity, a non-person in the financial world. They used to do this with Colombian drug barons, and they came up with a word for this, which was muerte civil, which means civil death. And there's nothing worse than being added to it. And the proudest thing for me is to watch all the victims around the world. And the Magnitsky Act doesn't just apply to Russia, it applies to bad guys everywhere now. I look at all the victims who now have hope of getting some recourse, some reprieve from what had happened to them by creating some punishment. And some of the biggest cases in front of me right now are the Uyghurs in China, who this whole population of people who are basically being rounded up and put into concentration camps. The murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, the Rohingya massacre, and all of these cases, the Magnitsky sanctions are a proper way of dealing with it. And I'm very happy to see people like Mike using the Magnitsky Act in cases where there's been atrocities, and many other human rights organizations doing the same thing. On China, Russia, Putin is really very foolish to have burned his relations with the West and thrown himself in with the Chinese, because on one side of the border, you have hundreds of millions of people and no resources, and on the other side of the border, you have hardly any people and all the natural resources. And China will gobble up Russia in 50 years. Putin should be aligning himself with the West to prevent that from happening. On rule of law and foreign direct investment in Russia, for reasons not necessarily to do with the Magnitsky Act, but reasons to do with Putin's own bad behavior after invading Crimea and all the other, and the sanctions that came from that, the level of foreign direct investment in Russia has dropped 95%. Nobody puts their money into Russia. And if anyone here has the urge to invest in Russia, lie down and wait half an hour until it passes.
Okay. All right. I think we're out of time, but can everyone join me in giving Bill a huge round of applause? Thank you, Bill.